Ethan was the kind of man people envy. A millionaire at 26, groomed for success, and the picture of perfection. But perfection had its price, and Ethan paid it daily. Wealth wrapped him in chains of expectations, his parents' expectations. Their vision of his life, meticulously designed, left no room for his own dreams. The city pulsed with life as Ethan hurried through the streets, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. He wasn't running from a stranger. He was running from his parents, their voices trailing behind him, demanding his return. This was the day they would present him to her, the woman carefully chosen to seal a business alliance. Marriage as a transaction, love as a casualty. His heart pounded as he wove through the crowd. He needed an escape. Desperation sharpened his senses until he noticed her, Lena. She sat against a crumbling brick wall, her figure small yet unyielding. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Beside her, a cardboard sign read, "Looking for a chance, not a handout." Their eyes locked. Hers was steady, almost challenging, in stark contrast to the chaos of his. For a moment, the cacophony of the city dulled, the world narrowing to this one connection. Two lives couldn't have been more different, yet something in that gaze made Ethan hesitate. The click of his father's shoes on the pavement jolted him back. They were close now, their stern faces scanning the crowd. In an instant, he made a decision, a reckless, impulsive decision. He crossed the street and knelt in front of Lena. The words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "Please trust me." He didn't wait for her response. He leaned in and their lips met. For a moment, the world stopped. The din of the city faded, replaced by the weight of 100 judging stares. Across the street, his parents froze, their shock turning to fury. Lena stiffened under the kiss, her body rigid with confusion. When Ethan pulled away, the tension hung heavy between them. "I've made my choice," he said, his voice steady yet trembling with defiance. His parents stared, their silence louder than words, before turning and walking away. Ethan exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. Lena stood slowly, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. What was that about? The weight of his actions pressed against his chest. I didn't know what else to do. I needed a way out." Her eyes narrowed, her tone cutting through the thin layer of his apology. "You used me." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She picked up her sign and turned to leave. "People like you always have a way out," she said over her shoulder, her words sharp and final. Ethan watched her walk away, her small figure swallowed by the crowd. He stood there, rooted in place, the judgment of strangers still prickling his skin. Yet it wasn't their stares that lingered. It was her words, echoing in his mind. He had meant the kiss to be an escape, a fleeting rebellion against a life he no longer wanted. But standing there, alone on that crowded street, he realized it had become something else entirely. A door had opened, a door he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. But he knew one thing: he couldn't go back. And neither could she. Ethan's life was a gilded cage. From the outside, it looked like perfection. He was a tech millionaire, living in a sprawling penthouse, with a future meticulously planned by his family. But within that cage, he felt suffocated. Every decision was weighed, scrutinized, and measured against his family's ideals. Their latest demand hung over him like a storm cloud, an arranged marriage. It wasn't about love or happiness. It was a transaction, a calculated move to merge wealth and power. Ethan sat in his sleek office, staring at the skyline. It should have inspired pride, but all he felt was emptiness. How had it come to this? He had spent years building something of his own, yet here he was, tethered to expectations he hadn't chosen. His hands gripped the edge of the desk as his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Ethan, it's time to stop chasing your little dreams. Think about the family, about what we built for you." Those words weighed heavily on him, as they always did. To the world, he was a man who had it all. Inside, he was just a son trying to break free. Duty and desire clashed within him like an unstoppable force meeting an unmovable wall. Every conversation with his parents ended the same way, guilt creeping in, twisting his resolve. They wanted him to be the perfect son, the one who upheld their name and legacy. But the more he tried to fit their mold, the more he felt like a shadow of himself. His penthouse, with its marble floors and expansive views, felt as hollow as his carefully curated life. Wealth had provided him everything except freedom. He thought back to a conversation with his closest friend, someone who had long since drifted away. "You've got everything, Ethan. Why aren't you happy?" Ethan hadn't answered then because he didn't know how. Now, the answer was painfully clear. Happiness wasn't found in riches or power. It was in living authentically, and he wasn't. On the other side of the city, Lena sat quietly on the edge of a worn fountain. At 22, life had already dealt her harsh blows. Estranged from her family, she had learned to navigate the unforgiving streets on her own. Her clothes, though old, were clean, and her chin remained lifted. Even here, amidst the noise and chaos, Lena held onto a dignity that couldn't be taken away. She had dreams of helping others escape the cycle she was trapped in, but dreams didn't pay for meals. She held a cardboard sign in her lap, looking for a chance, not a handout. Passersby glanced at her but quickly averted their eyes. To them, she was invisible, another shadow among the many. But Lena wasn't broken. She watched the world with quiet resilience, determined to carve a path forward. Ethan and Lena's worlds couldn't have been more different. One lived in luxury, the other in survival. Yet both shared the invisible weight of their struggles. Ethan's battles were hidden, masked by wealth and status. Lena's were written on her face, in the lines of exhaustion and determination. But beneath the surface, they were the same. Two souls yearning for freedom, for something real. That morning, their paths crossed for the first time. Ethan was walking quickly, his hands shoved into his pockets, his mind racing with the argument he'd had with his parents. He was supposed to meet his future wife that afternoon, a woman he'd never spoken to but was expected to marry. Lena sat near a busy street corner, watching people pass. She noticed him before he saw her, his sharp suit, his expensive shoes, the tension in his jaw. He looked lost, out of place in the sea of faces. When their eyes met, it was like time slowed. Ethan stopped, startled by her steady gaze. Her eyes held something he couldn't define, resilience, perhaps, or maybe defiance. She didn't look away. Ethan's parents were closing in. He could hear their voices behind him, feel their presence. Panic set in. He needed to act, to escape, to do something they wouldn't expect. Then he turned and saw Lena again. An idea formed, reckless and impulsive. He approached her, kneeling down as if they were old friends. She raised an eyebrow, wary but curious. "Please," he said quietly, "just trust me for a moment." Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her. The world seemed to hold its breath. People stopped mid-step, their conversations falling silent. Across the street, Ethan's parents froze, their shock giving way to fury. Linda didn't pull away, but her body stiffened. When he finally broke the kiss, her eyes burned with questions. He stood quickly, turning to face his parents. "I've made my choice," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. His mother's expression hardened. His father's voice was cold and sharp. "This isn't over, Ethan." They turned and walked away, their presence as commanding in retreat as it was in approach. Ethan exhaled, the adrenaline fading. Then he turned back to Lena. She was standing now, brushing off her skirt, her gaze cutting through him. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. He hesitated. I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I needed a way out." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "So you used me." The words hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't mean. People like you always have a way out," she said, picking up her sign. She didn't wait for his response as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. She was right. He had a way out. She didn't. It was just a kiss, a fleeting moment in a day filled with chaos. But Ethan knew it was more than that. He didn't understand how or why, but that moment had changed something, for both of them, and he couldn't walk away from it. Ethan's impulsive kiss had been a fleeting act of rebellion, but the consequences rippled through his life like a stone cast into still water. His family, ever watchful and rigid, reacted as if he had committed an unforgivable sin. The dining room, usually silent except for the clinking of silverware, was now filled with tension. His father stood at the head of the table, his expression carved in stone. "How dare you humiliate this family like that, Ethan?" His voice was steady, but the undertone of fury was unmistakable. "You've made a mockery of everything we stand for." Ethan sat across from him, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "What we stand for," he said slowly, "is control. I won't live like this anymore." His mother's gasp cut through the air, sharp and accusing. "After everything we've done for you? You throw it away for some street performance." "It wasn't a performance," Ethan shot back, his voice trembling. "It was my decision, mine for once." But his words held no weight here. His father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you refuse to follow our plans, you'll have nothing. No inheritance, no company, nothing." Ethan froze, the full weight of his father's ultimatum crashing down on him. Conform or lose everything. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse. The city lights stretched endlessly before him, yet they felt cold, distant. He thought of the life his parents had built for him, a life of luxury, prestige, and emptiness. Everything he had, everything he was, came with strings. He ran his fingers through his hair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. How could something so carefully constructed feel so meaningless? The memory of his parents' words played on a loop in his mind. No inheritance, no company. They were willing to strip him of everything, all for the sake of control. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he wondered if losing it all would be worth it. Freedom had a cost, but so did living a life that wasn't his own. Across the city, Lena was feeling the fallout in her own way. She had returned to her usual spot by the fountain, but something was different. People lingered longer when they passed her. Some whispered, others pointed. Her picture had made it to the tabloids. A homeless girl involved in a millionaire scandal. Headlines didn't care about context, only spectacle. And she had become the spectacle of the day. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her own path. But the whispers gnawed at her, each one a reminder of how society saw her. Not as a person, but as a story. "Can't even sit in peace now," she muttered under her breath, clutching her cardboard sign tightly. It wasn't long before Ethan sought her out. He found her near the fountain, sitting with her knees drawn to her chest. She saw him before he spoke, her expression worried, her eyes tired. "I came to apologize," he began, standing awkwardly a few feet away. "For what?" Her voice was calm, but edged with steel. "For using me, or for running back to your mansion afterward?" Her words stung, but he didn't flinch. "Both," he admitted. "I acted without thinking, and you paid for it. I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You don't get it, do you? You kissed me, and now I'm the girl people whisper about. You go back to your world, but I'm still here." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "You're right," he said finally. "I don't get it, but I want to. I want to understand." Her skepticism was evident. People like him always wanted to understand, but they rarely did. Still, something about his tone gave her pause. She softened slightly, though her guard remained. "Understanding isn't just words," she said quietly. "It's seeing, feeling." For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of her world. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but he knew he couldn't walk away. That encounter stayed with him long after he left. Her words echoed in his mind, planting seeds of doubt about everything he thought he knew. For years, he had believed his wealth and status were shields, protecting him from the harshness of life. Now he realized they were walls, keeping him from seeing beyond himself. He sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. The streets below bustled with life, each person carrying a story he would never know. He thought of Lena, of her resilience, of her strength. For the first time in his life, he questioned not just his actions, but the values that shaped him. Ethan's apology had been a step forward, but it was only the beginning. Change wasn't easy, and neither was understanding. As he wrestled with the burden of his privilege, he began to see cracks in the foundation of his world. This wasn't just about Lena or his family. It was about him, about who he was and who he wanted to be. And for the first time, Ethan knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was a path worth walking. Ethan didn't know why he kept returning to the fountain where he had met Lena. At first, it felt like an act of defiance, a way to show his family he wouldn't fall back in line. But soon it became something else. Lena intrigued him. There was a quiet strength about her, an unwavering resolve that seemed untouched by the hardships she faced. At first, she didn't make it easy for him. Each time he approached her, she would arch an eyebrow and fold her arms as if daring him to explain himself. "What do you want now?" she asked one day, her tone a mix of weariness and curiosity. "Maybe to learn," Ethan replied, surprising even himself. Lena laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Learn what? How to walk a mile without your fancy shoes." But over time, her sharp edges softened. Ethan wasn't just watching her anymore, he was stepping into her world. Walking through the city with Lena was like peeling back a curtain he hadn't realized was there. She took him to places he'd never seen. Alleys filled with makeshift shelters, soup kitchens bustling with quiet dignity, parks where people gathered not for leisure, but for survival. "This," she said, gesturing to the chaos around them, "is the world you never see. It's not in your skyline view, but it's just as real." Ethan watched as Lena moved through the spaces with ease, greeting people by name, asking about their families, sharing a laugh where she could. It was a far cry from the polished dinners and hollow conversations he was used to. He felt a knot in his stomach as he realized how blind he had been. To him, life had been about rising to the top. For the people Lena introduced him to, it was about holding on, one day at a time. One afternoon, he saw Lena pull a small loaf of bread from her bag. She handed it to a man sitting on a bench, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. The man's face lit up, and he took her hand in his, whispering words of thanks. "Why do you do it?" Ethan asked later, his voice quiet. Lena shrugged. "Because someone has to, and because it doesn't cost anything to care." Her words stayed with him. That night, he thought about how many opportunities he had let pass by, how often he had chosen indifference over action. It wasn't until Lena shared her story that Ethan truly began to understand her. They were sitting by the fountain, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the square. "I wasn't always like this," Lena began, her voice steady, but tinged with pain. "I had a family once, not perfect, but good enough. Then it all fell apart." She told him about the betrayal, a father who left, a mother who spiraled, a world that became colder and less forgiving. By the time she was 18, she was on her own, carrying the weight of too many broken promises. "But you keep going," she said, looking at him directly. "Because what else is there? You find reasons to hope, even if they're small." Ethan felt something stir inside him, empathy, admiration, and a deep respect for the strength it took to survive what she had. The next day, Ethan joined Lena at a local shelter. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. The people there looked at him with suspicion, their eyes lingering on his expensive clothes. But Lena stayed by his side, guiding him. "Just listen," she whispered. "Sometimes, that's all people need." Ethan spent hours serving meals, cleaning tables, and talking to the shelter's visitors. He heard stories of loss and resilience, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Each story chipped away at the armor he had built around himself. By the end of the day, he was exhausted, but it was a different kind of tired, one that came with purpose. As Ethan walked home that evening, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The privilege he had once taken for granted now felt like a responsibility. He had the means to make a difference, and for the first time, he wanted to. His transformation wasn't sudden, but it was real. He began to see his wealth not as a shield, but as a tool, a way to bridge the gap between his world and Lena's. Lena noticed the change in him. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was showing up with intention. One afternoon, as they sat together, she finally let her guard down. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft. "I want to help people. Really help them. Maybe become a social worker or something." Ethan smiled. "You'd be good at that." For the first time in a long time, Lena allowed herself to believe it might be possible. But their growing bond didn't go unnoticed. Ethan's family stepped in, their disapproval sharp and unrelenting. "She's using you," his mother said, her voice icy. "Can't you see that? She's a threat to everything we've built." Ethan's father was more direct. "End it, now, or you're done." The accusations stung, not because Ethan believed them, but because they revealed how little this family understood him. Lena, too, felt the pressure. She began to pull away, afraid that staying in Ethan's life would cause more harm than good. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything," she told him one evening, her voice breaking. "You're not," Ethan replied firmly. "You're the reason I'm finding something real." The confrontation with his family was inevitable. Ethan stood before them, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I'm done living for your approval," he said. "I'm choosing a life that means something." His father's silence spoke volumes, but for the first time, Ethan didn't care. He had made his choice. Lena and Ethan's partnership became something more, a union of purpose. Together, they began to build something greater than themselves, proving that even in a world divided by wealth and hardship, connection could spark change. Their story wasn't just about love, it was about transformation, hope, and the power of choosing a different path. Ethan stood at the head of the long dining table, his hands gripping its polished edge. The room was silent, but the tension was electric. His father sat at the far end, his mother to his right, their expressions cold and expectant. The same table where deals were struck, alliances formed, and control and force would now witness something entirely different. "I can't do this anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I won't live the life you've chosen for me." His father leaned back in his chair, a faint sneer curling at the edges of his lips. "And what exactly do you think you'll do without us? Without the foundation we built for you?" Ethan straightened, the weight of his words bearing down on him. "I'll build something better, something meaningful." His father's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Meaningful? You've never had to struggle a day in your life. Do you even know what that means?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't understand before, but I do now, and I have no intention of following in your footsteps. This isn't what Mom would have wanted." His mother flinched, but his father's eyes darkened. "Don't bring her into this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Ethan pressed on. "She believed in kindness, in using what we have to help others. You turned that into power and control. I won't let her legacy be that." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and defiance. The argument escalated, emotions boiling over as years of buried resentment came to the surface. Ethan's father leaned forward, his voice rising. "You think you're better than this family, than the sacrifices we made to give you everything." "I think I'm different," Ethan replied, meeting his father's gaze. "And I think that's okay." His mother's voice broke through, trembling with both anger and sorrow. "You're throwing everything away for what? For some ideal? For people," Ethan said simply. "For a purpose." The room fell silent again, but this time it was Ethan who controlled the narrative. His father's grip on him, once unyielding, was beginning to crack. A week later, Ethan stood on a small stage in a community hall. The air was thick with anticipation. He glanced at Lena, who stood just off to the side, her expression a mixture of pride and disbelief. "This isn't just about me," Ethan began, addressing the crowd. "It's about what we can do when we choose to care. For too long, I used my privilege to shield myself from the world's realities. That ends today." He outlined the first steps of his new initiative, a program dedicated to supporting the homeless and providing educational opportunities. The applause that followed wasn't just for him, it was for the possibility of change. He turned to Lena, his voice soft but resolute. "None of this would have happened without her. She taught me what resilience looks like, what hope looks like." Lena blinked back tears but stayed rooted, her strength holding them both upright. Their newfound purpose wasn't without its challenges. During the launch of their program, a man stepped forward from the crowd, his movements unsteady, his voice thick with anger. "You think this fixes anything?" He spat, his hands trembling. "People like you are the reason we're here in the first place." Ethan raised his hands in a calming gesture, his heart racing. "I understand your frustration. I'm not here to erase the past, but to build a better future." The man wasn't convinced. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a blade. The crowd gasped, chaos erupting. But before Ethan could react, Lena stepped forward. "Put it down," she said, her voice steady, commanding. "You're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't the way." Her words, calm and measured, seemed to reach him. The man hesitated, the blade trembling in his hand before it clattered to the ground. Security rushed in, but Lena stayed with him, speaking softly until he was led away. That night, Ethan sat with Lena under the stars. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only the quiet hum of gratitude. "You saved me today," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lena shook her head. "We saved each other." He reached for her hand, their connection unspoken but deeply felt. Together, they had faced fear and found courage, built bridges where walls once stood. In the months that followed, Ethan and Lena's partnership became a beacon of hope. Their program flourished, providing not just aid but opportunity. They showed that even from the most unlikely beginnings, change could grow. Their bond, forged in adversity, became a symbol of what was possible when two worlds collided, not in conflict, but in unity. And as they stood before a crowd at yet another milestone event, Ethan took the microphone, his voice clear and strong. "This isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's just the beginning." The applause was deafening, but it wasn't the sound of victory. It was the sound of hope. Ethan and Lena's relationship wasn't built on fairy tale notions of love. It was rooted in something deeper, a shared purpose, a mutual respect born from seeing each other at their most vulnerable. They had walked different paths to this moment, but those paths had converged in a way neither could have imagined. Ethan admired Lena's resilience, her ability to rise above challenges that would have crushed others. She wasn't afraid to call out his privilege, to make him see the world through her eyes. In return, Lena saw a man who was willing to change, to confront the comfort of his past for the uncertainty of something better. Their bond grew stronger with every step they took together, each decision guided by the simple but powerful question, how can we make things better? It didn't take long for their shared vision to take shape. Together, they founded Bridges of Hope, an organization dedicated to providing education, shelter, and resources to underprivileged communities. Ethan brought the funding, the connections, and the will to change the system that had once defined him. Lena brought the heart, the ground-level understanding of what people needed most. Their efforts didn't just give immediate aid, they built opportunities for people to create lasting change in their own lives. The name wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. Their first project was a community center located between two neighborhoods that had long been divided by socioeconomic barriers. A bridge, Lena said, her voice full of hope, for people to meet in the middle. Their work quickly became a symbol of what could happen when different worlds came together, not to conquer, but to collaborate. One afternoon, Ethan stood outside his father's office. It had been months since their last encounter, and though time had lessened the sting of their confrontation, the wounds hadn't fully healed. When his father opened the door, the silence between them was heavy. They sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken words. "I didn't expect to see you here," his father finally said, his tone guarded. "I didn't come to argue," Ethan replied. "I came to show you what I've been working on." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photos and reports detailing the success of Bridges of Hope. His father flipped through them silently, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost contemplative. "Your mother would have been proud." It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. For the first time, Ethan felt a fragile sense of understanding between them. Lena's dream of becoming a social worker became reality when she received her certification. The first person she helped was a young woman who reminded her of herself. A girl with nowhere to turn, burdened by the weight of broken trust. "I know what it's like," Lena said as she handed her the keys to a small apartment funded by their program. "This isn't just a place to live. It's a chance to start over." That moment, and the countless others that followed, reminded Lena of why she had fought so hard. Her journey from homelessness to a life of purpose wasn't just her story. It was a message to anyone who felt trapped by their circumstances. You can rise above this. Ethan and Lena's work wasn't perfect, and they knew it. There were setbacks, frustrations, moments when it felt like they weren't doing enough. But they also knew that change didn't happen overnight. What mattered was the intention, the decision to care, to act, to connect. Their story underscored a simple but profound truth. Empathy and courage could transform lives, not just for those in need, but for those willing to help. Years later, as they stood on a stage together, addressing a crowd that had grown far beyond what they had ever imagined, Ethan looked at Lena with the same admiration he had felt since the beginning. "This isn't about us," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about what happens when people choose to see each other, really see each other. It's about building bridges, not walls." Lena took the microphone, her voice warm and sure. "We're proof that no matter where you come from, no matter what divides us, connection is possible, change is possible, and it starts with each of us." The applause that followed wasn't for them, it was for the idea they represented. As the evening ended, Ethan and Lena stood together, watching the crowd disperse. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Ethan asked, his tone reflective. Lena smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not like this, but I always believed it was possible." They didn't need to say more. In their hearts, they knew their journey wasn't just about them. It was about the countless lives they had touched, and the countless more they would continue to inspire. What are the moments that have shaped your journey? The choices, the challenges, the quiet triumphs that transformed you into the person you are today. Life isn't just a series of events. It's the meaning we find in them, the lessons we carry forward. Think about those moments. What did they teach you? How did they change the way you see the world? Take a moment to reflect. Let those memories surface, even the painful ones, because every step of the journey matters. Now imagine the power of sharing those stories, not just for yourself, but for someone who might need to hear them. Your experiences, your growth, your acts of kindness could be the spark that inspires someone else to keep going. In the comments, share a story that shaped you. It could be a time when you overcame a challenge, helped someone in need, or found hope when it seemed out of reach. When we tell our stories, we create a connection, a bridge between our hearts and the hearts of others. These bridges aren't just for support, they're for healing, for understanding. And sometimes, they're the lifeline someone else needs to believe in a better tomorrow. Together, we can create something extraordinary, a community built on inspiration and kindness, a space where we don't just share our experiences but lift each other up, one story at a time. If this story moved you, stay with us on this journey. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories of courage, transformation, and hope. By subscribing, you're not just joining a channel, you're becoming part of a family that believes in the power of change, the power of connection. And remember, it doesn't take much to make a difference. A kind word, a helping hand, a moment of understanding. These small acts ripple outward in ways we can't always see. You have the power to create those ripples. Carry these lessons with you. Let them guide your actions, your choices, and when you see the opportunity to brighten someone's path, take it. Then, share what happens, because your ripple could inspire the next.